The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of History Nebraska. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. This year marks 150 years since Fort Robinson was established in western Nebraska. To commemorate this anniversary, this episode looks back at an article written in 1997 by Frank Schubert titled 10 Troopers, Buffalo Soldiers Medal of Honor Men Who Served at Fort Robinson. There are many reasons to be fond of Fort Robinson. And for me, one of the most remarkable things about the post is that so many of the Buffalo soldiers who received the Medal of Honor served there. 10 of the 23 who received the medal for actions in frontier conflicts or the Cuban Campaign of 1898 served at the post. 7 of them had already earned the medal. These included 9th Cavalrymen Emanuel Stantz, George Jordan, Thomas Shaw, Henry Johnson, Augustus Wally, Brent Woods, and John Denny. An 8th, William O. Wilson, earned the medal while assigned there. 2 of these men, Jordan and Denny, even retired to the nearby town of Crawford, although Denny ultimately moved back east and died at the soldiers' home in Washington, D.C. Another, William H. Tompkins, served there first, then received the medal for valor in Cuba later. And the last, George H. Wanton, received the medal in Cuba and then served there with the 10th U.S. Cavalry. Incidentally, an 11th, Moses Williams of the 9th U.S. Cavalry, served down the road at Fort Niobrara. But 10 of the 23, 10 of 19, if we only count the regulars and leave out the Seminole Negro Scouts, were there. And this fact about Fort Robinson makes it a singular place to me. So who were these heroes, these black men who were singled out for recognition because of valor in combat by a society that only rarely and begrudgingly honored black achievement? Readers familiar with Edward M. Kaufman's The Old Army, or maybe my book on Fort Robinson, already have a pretty good idea of the shape of the Buffalo soldier community from whence the 23 came. For them, soldiering was a more attractive occupational choice than it was for whites, so they tended to stay in the U.S. Army longer. Consequently, they more often tended to be married and have children than other soldiers. The 23 holders of the Medal of Honor share these characteristics of the Buffalo soldier community. Most were career soldiers. 13 of the 19 regulars and 2 of the 4 Seminole Negro Scouts served 25 years or more. Of the rest, only Scout Adam Payne and deserter William Wilson served less than 5 years. Despite their long service and retirements before the age of 50, early in life by civilian standards, few lived long enough to enjoy their retirements much. They had lived and worked hard under austere and perilous conditions, indulged in the normal amount of carousing along the way, and survived only a few years beyond retirement age. Only George Wanton and Augustus Wally reached what could be considered a ripe old age. A large portion of the group was also married, at least 13 and perhaps as many as 15. So in major ways, the group fit the expected profile of black soldiers at large. They were family men and inclined to stay in the U.S. Army. Overall, the 23 made up a group of heroes, not a group of saints. People who want to use Buffalo soldiers as role models and examples for young people to emulate have to understand that the troopers at Fort Robinson were human beings. And even though black soldiers tended in general to represent less of a discipline problem than whites, reflecting their more durable commitment to the Army, these men were a rough and tumble bunch in a wild and woolly environment. There were some very good citizens among them. You could look long and hard at the records of George Jordan and Thomas Shaw and never find a blemish. But to a large extent, they fought and brawled and drank and whored. After turn-of-the-century service in the Philippines introduced many to new vices, they might have also gone into town for a snort of cocaine or a toke on an opium pipe every once in a while, just like lesser soldiers. Of course, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz, the first black regular to receive the Medal of Honor, stands out in his duality as the bully and hero. But there was also William Wilson, who earned the Medal for Valor at Drexel Mission, South Dakota, during the Pine Ridge Campaign of 1890 and 91, and who deserted while still on his first enlistment. Wilson's daughter Anna once attributed his reluctance to talk about his time in the Army to his natural modesty. I think deserters tend to be modest about their military service for other reasons. As for the others, generally the group had its share of problems with military discipline. 8 of the 19 regulars had court-martial convictions and 6 were reduced to private at least once. At least 2, William McBriar and George Wanton, also contracted venereal disease. Not surprisingly, most of the recipients came from the 9th Cavalry. In campaigning against the Apache Indians between 1877 and 1881, the 9th saw the most severe and protracted fighting experienced by any of the 4 black regiments. The nature of the combat against these fierce and tenacious native fighters, with small detachments engaged in long pursuits and short, violent skirmishes in which quick reaction sometimes meant the difference between life and death, put a premium on sound judgment and unflinching courage. The struggles with Victorio and Nana, also in the Southwest, tested the soldiers of the 9th repeatedly, and when they met the challenge, brought them the most recognition. But it should be noted, the number of medals awarded to the regiment also said a great deal about their officers. They cared about the men who served under them and saw that they received the recognition that they earned. The Buffalo Soldier heroes showed an enduring patriotism that withstood long years of second-class citizenship. The few who lived to see the onset of World War I volunteered their services to the Army despite their advanced age. None were quite as persistent as George W. Ford, the old cavalryman who had joined the 10th when it was organized in 1866 and still volunteered for duty in 1917 at the age of 67. But Augustus Wally was over 60, and William McBriar was in his late 50s when both volunteered and were rebuffed because of their age. None of the medal recipients achieved any post-military successes. Most were essentially used up by the service, and all were affected by the lack of opportunity in the pervasively racist environment of their time. But there may have been more to the overall lack of accomplishment than general exhaustion and discrimination. Columnist Murray Kempton observed just 1 year before his death in 1997 that he, quote, cannot think of an enlisted man tried in the line and certified a hero who was ever afterward rewarded with large honors in peacetime, end quote. Kempton was thinking in particular of political success, but there may have been something in the perspective gained by willingly putting one's life at great risk that makes other striving less important or meaningful. The careers of these men throw important light on the relations between blacks and Indians on the frontier. 16 of the 23 received their medals for action in wars against Indian peoples. This fact clashes with the expectation of some people today that the mere fact of non-whiteness should constitute the prima facie basis for an alliance or common cause among people of color against white oppressor. It cannot be overemphasized that the soldiers were Anglophones. They spoke English and represented a sedentary, agrarian, industrial, English-speaking culture. Many were recently freed and new citizens in this framework, eager to validate their claims on citizenship by wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Very few looked across the culture chasm that separated them from the semi-nomadic warrior hunters with whom they did battle and perceived any similarity between their respective conditions. Culture created a gap that was virtually unbridgeable. This fundamental opposition may be frustrating and even incomprehensible to people seeking to impose a rainbow coalition frame of reference on the past, but it existed all the same. It was basic to the worldview of virtually all who claimed American citizenship. As William W. Gwaltney, himself a descendant of Buffalo soldiers, said, quote, "Buffalo soldiers fought for recognition as citizens in a racist country, and American Indian people fought to hold on to their traditions, their land, and their lives, end quote. Even today, the huge gap between the soldiers and the warrior tribes of the West sometimes influences perceptions. In the summer of 1995, I took a busload of tourists to Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, to view the scene of William Wilson's brave dash for help in December of 1890. For the previous 3 days, I had been unable to convince some of the people on that bus, particularly a skeptical black reporter, that the Plains Indians and the Buffalo Soldiers viewed each other across a cultural abyss. Then everything cleared up for him as the others who shared his view. At the base of the hill on which sits the Wounded Knee Cemetery, a Sioux woman stopped her car and asked my journalist friend, who was walking with my wife, what he was doing at Wounded Knee. When he said that he was on a Buffalo Soldier tour, she replied, quote, "Buffalo Soldiers and the white man killed my people. My ancestors are up there, and I don't appreciate you being here. Why don't you go visit Abraham Lincoln's grave?" End quote. Then she sped off. The reporter said that he left Wounded Knee with a, quote, "dull, sick, guilty feeling in the pit of my stomach," end quote. He also learned something about imposing present-day values and expectations on the past. Their experiences of one of the Medal of Honor recipients, Henry Johnson of the 9th Cavalry, shows us that even people who are not separated by long periods of time can bring wildly different perceptions to bear on the same event. Johnson received his medal for valor during the fight with the Ute Indians on the Milk River in Colorado during September 1879. The circumstances that led to the battle involved a familiar process: white encroachments onto Ute lands, and the efforts of an Indian agent to force children into schools and adults onto farms caused increasing native anger, confrontations, and finally, a panicky call for troops. Major Thomas T. Thornburg rushed to the rescue, got himself killed, and left his command in serious trouble. The first troops to arrive on the scene, 3 days after the Utes sprang their ambush and trapped the soldiers behind mounds of rotting horse carcasses, were Captain Francis S. Dodge and the veteran Buffalo Soldier of D Troop, 9th Cavalry. Dodge's arrival had been immortalized by Frederick Remington of the painting Captain Dodge's Troopers to the Rescue. But a strange kind of rescue it was. The Utes watched in astonishment as Dodge charged right into the trap. He did contribute fresh rifles to the defense and ultimately received a Medal of Honor for coming to the rescue, but the basic situation after his arrival remained unchanged. The Utes still surrounded the soldiers, and the dead horses continued to pile up. There was reason for the Indians to be amazed at this display of soldier behavior. Henry Johnson ultimately received the Medal of Honor for his efforts on Milk River. He was cited for 2 actions in particular: leaving his position under heavy fire to make the rounds of the forward detachment and check his men, and risking his life to fill canteens for the wounded from Milk River. Milk River was near, but the Utes were always watching. Only at night did soldiers sneak down to the river to fill canteens for the command, especially the wounded, some of whom suffered greatly from thirst. Johnson went to the river on October 4th, making sure that there was enough water for the wounded by doing so. There are 3 views of what happened that night when Dodge sent him and a party of troopers to the river. First, there's Johnson's. He later remembered that the Indians had fired on them, but they had fought their way to the river, filled the canteens, and returned safely. Others disagreed, and 2 alternative explanations to the dash for water emerged. Caleb Benson, a young Buffalo Soldier of D Troop who had lied about his age to enlist and who retired from Fort Robinson to nearby Crawford, reminisced about the White River Campaign 55 years later in an interview with a Nebraska newspaper. Benson remembered an affinity between the black cavalrymen and the Indians. He claimed, erroneously, that 2 white soldiers were killed while getting river water for coffee, although 9th Cavalry cooks had done so without harm. Benson recalled that, quote, "The Indians never shot a colored man unless it was necessary. They always wanted to win the friendship of the Negro race and obtain their aid in campaigns against the white man," end quote. According to Benson's view, Johnson made it to the river without drawing fire because the Indians sympathized with the blacks. Another view, expressed by Robert Emmett in his book on the Utes, also held that the Utes did not expend much ammunition on the black troopers. However, Emmett did not attribute this one-sided truce to racial empathy. He claimed that the Indians were contemptuous of the Buffalo Soldiers because they carried water for the white soldiers. Quote, "All soldiers were funny," end quote, to the Utes, according to Emmett. But these Buffalo Soldiers, quote, "were the funniest soldiers Chief Colorado or any man had ever seen," end quote. According to this view, the Utes were not impressed with the water detail. They watched as two of the troopers came out of the impromptu fort. The warriors, quote, "began to wave and shout at them," end quote. To the amazement of the Utes, the Buffalo Soldiers carried buckets instead of rifles. They were going down to the river for water and did not wave back. In fact, they acted as though they did not even hear the shouting from the hills. Quote, "The Buffalo Soldiers," it seemed to the Utes, "had not come to fight. They had come to work for the white soldiers," end quote, making the young Ute warriors very disappointed. They did not waste bullets on such people. Whatever the Utes thought, the soldiers who went out for water felt positively threatened when they left their makeshift defenses. Johnson convinced the War Department that his actions were indeed heroic, and he received his Medal of Honor at Fort Robinson on September 22nd of 1890. According to the citation, he had voluntarily left fortified shelter and under heavy fire at close range made the rounds of the pits to instruct the guards and had fought his way to the creek and back to bring water to the wounded. But there were at least three conflicting views of what actually happened. When Johnson pinned on the medal, he was a private in K Troop. He had risen back up to sergeant for the third time by 1889, but tangled with the bartender at the Fort Robinson Post Canteen after the latter cut him off, so he lost his stripes again. In addition to Johnson, K Troop had two other Medal of Honor heroes, First Sergeant George Jordan and Sergeant Thomas Shaw. 30-year men like Johnson, they both got the award for leadership in battle during the Apache Wars. Jordan retired from Robinson and remained in Crawford. Shaw left the Army at Fort Myer across the river from Washington and stayed in suburban Virginia. Unlike Henry Johnson, these two fine soldiers had unblemished records and long, uninterrupted tenures as non-commissioned officers. Both retired as sergeants. Shaw was one of the first-generation Buffalo Soldiers who staked their claim on citizenship by taking up its responsibilities as a soldier. A broad-shouldered, be-whiskered, and mature non-commissioned officer, when he served at Fort Robinson, Shaw had nothing about him or his manner to suggest that he had once been a slave. But he had started out in the U.S. Army after walking away from his master during the Civil War and into a Union recruiting station. A soldier from that time on, Shaw possessed an upright posture and a firm gaze. One look at him tells you that you are in the presence of a tough, seasoned veteran, experienced, poised, and dignified. George Jordan was also well-liked and highly respected old trooper with the bearing of a professional soldier. Emanuel Stantz, who served at Fort Robinson too, had intrigued me ever since I started researching Buffalo Soldiers nearly 30 years ago. The first Buffalo Soldier to receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership against Indians in Texas in 1870, Stantz was barely 20 years old and just over 5 feet tall. He was also a harsh and violent disciplinarian. He had a string of court-martials that started in 1869 when an argument with Saddler John Graves over a misplaced curry comb escalated quickly to threats, with Stantz warning Graves that he would, quote, mash his mouth, end quote, and finally both men throwing punches. Captain Henry Carroll, defending Stantz at the court-martial, called him, quote, one of the best sergeants I have in my company, end quote, and he said that he had always been attentive to duty and shown a wish to improve himself in tactics. Then Stantz got into a nasty brawl with First Sergeant Henry Greene of his troop in December of 1872. In the course of that fray, Stantz bit off a part of Greene's lower lip, resulting in a mayhem charge that cost him his stripes and 6 months in the guardhouse. From that time on, it was chutes and ladders for Stantz, regaining his stripes, getting busted, and regaining his stripes, at least 5 times until he arrived at Fort Robinson with his troop in 1885 as a first sergeant. When he got there, he had already survived an attempt on his life by a trooper at Fort Reno, Indian Territory, in 1883. Stantz had dropped his pipe on the barracks floor and someone had accidentally kicked it under a bunk. Stantz accused Private Moses Greene, drew his saber, and threatened to run him through. After others separated them, Greene went outside to the woodpile, selected a thick log, returned to the barracks, and waited for his tormentor. When Stantz returned to the squad room, Greene struck hard, laying open Stantz's head and breaking his arm. As Greene said at his court-martial, quote, "I knew that if I hadn't struck Stantz a strong blow, he'd injure me, as it is his habit of striking men with the carbine, and I knew that if I didn't give Stantz a strong blow, he'd get up and injure me, because it is his custom to strike men," end quote. Private Greene got 10 months, a pretty light sentence for almost crushing a sergeant's skull, because the court, referring to Stantz's threat with the saber, acknowledged, quote, "the unreasonable and ill-advised conduct of Sergeant Stantz toward the prisoner," end quote. Old habits die hard, and Emmanuel Stantz never got the message. At Fort Robinson, he continued to browbeat and terrorize his soldiers. For all of his experience and age, he was still the Emmanuel Stantz who had taken a bite out of a sergeant's lip, wiry, battle-hardened, and belligerent. As first sergeant, he became the center of a series of disputes and brawls which hit F Troop during the last half of 1887. 10 disturbances in that period involved 8 of the 45 or so privates and 4 of the 10 non-commissioned officers. Stantz, the senior sergeant in the troop, was himself involved in 4 confrontations. Overall, F Troop was a tense and volatile environment in which sergeants and privates were frequently at odds, sometimes violently so, while the troop commander, Captain Clarence A. Stedman, watched and at least tacitly approved this style of leadership. Stantz's behavior had tragic consequences. Just 1 year after sewing his 4th gold 5-year chevron on his right sleeve, on Christmas morning, 1887, he was found on the road to Crawford, shot dead with a service revolver. All of the circumstantial evidence pointed to the men in Stantz's own troop. So who did it? Perhaps it was Private Lewis Glenn, who once warned Stantz that he was, quote, "tired of you bulldozing me, Sergeant Stantz," end quote. Or it could have been blacksmith George Waterford, who growled at Stantz that, quote, "anyone who approaches me this morning is tired of living," end quote. Or Private Miller Miles, the soldier with chronic syphilis who was charged but ultimately freed because witnesses could not be found. We know Stantz browbeat and terrorized the soldiers under him, that some warned him to back off, and he did not, and that Private Simpson Mann, who arrived a year after Stantz was murdered, told historian Don Rickey many years later that he had heard that the victim had been dirty mean and that the men of F Troop had done him in. No one was convicted of the crime, but Stantz most likely was killed by one of his own men in the ultimate protest against the kind of leadership that he embodied and that Captain Stedman and the regimental officers condoned. Stantz's personal effects were as intriguing as the man himself. He apparently left his Medal of Honor and an autobiography, never found as far as I know, among his possessions. He also left his pipes, a gold watch and chain, and an Indian beaded necklace suggesting tantalizing picture of a frontier dandy to go along with the image of a mercurial little tyrant. Emmanuel Stantz left an ambivalent legacy. As the recipient of the first Medal of Honor awarded to a black regular, he was the original, officially recognized hero in a new phase of the history of black soldiers in the service of the United States. His small physical stature and youth at the time of his award provide attractive material for modern motivational speakers to use with juvenile audiences, and at least one children's book celebrates his bravery. The reason for this appeal is clear. Stance's divisive and bold behavior in the face of an armed enemy represents the finest tradition of the American soldier. But his leadership at other times showed serious shortcomings. Stance was an imperfect, flawed hero. But the same could be said, albeit less emphatically, of most of the Buffalo Soldier recipients of the Medal of Honor. With Thomas Shaw and George Jordan at one end of the scale and Emmanuel Stance at the other, the rest lived somewhere in between. They came down occasionally with what was euphemistically called a, quote, loathsome disease, end quote, or forfeited their stripes for losing their temper, getting drunk, and starting a fight. But such transgressions do not diminish their achievements or their stature. The fact is that you can find plenty of heroes in the frontier army. It is just not a good place to look for saints. And these Buffalo Soldiers were by and large singular heroes, emerging from slavery, overcoming huge obstacles, and gaining the respect of the soldiers who followed them into battle and the officers who trusted them with independent commands. They were heroes, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of History Nebraska, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, for History Nebraska, I'm Chris Goforth.